I'm interviewing Jeff Dacus, a.k.a. George Washington. Would you please introduce yourself?
Okay, as I said, I'm Jeff Dacus. I have been portraying George Washington for about 5 years here at the festival. It was originally in Sequim, and when it moved here, I continued to portray him. I also speak at schools and other historical functions. I am an author of several books, articles, a writer of articles in several both online and print magazines. I was a school teacher, 8th grade U.S. history teacher for 35 years, and the American Revolution time period is part of my favorite time, from the colonial times to the federal period. I enjoy.
Well, I'd like to explore several of those threads independently, if you don't mind, being a 37-year teacher myself. What you're doing, and a history teacher for 20 of those years.
Very good.
Vocational auto mechanics for 17. So 2 completely different careers. But how did you get involved in reenacting?
It started out when I was asked by a group of local people. I live in Vancouver, Washington, and there was a group of reenactors in Woodland, and they portrayed a group of colonial soldiers, and I outfitted myself and began going to some of their functions, and then I kind of set that aside for a while, and then about 7-8 years ago I talked to Vern, and Vern was portraying George, and when he stepped away from being George at our local festival in Sequim, I thought that I could step in and possibly do that, as George Washington is one of my heroes, so to speak. So I thought it would be fun to do that.
When you reenact, what ideas, what ideals, what characteristics of George Washington are you trying to get across to your audience?
Well, normally when I speak, as this morning and this afternoon I'll be doing presentations, I do a narrative of his life. So it's more of an informational type speaking to let people know who George Washington was, what he did, where he went, all the activities he was involved in, so that they know that George Washington is not just a picture of a man on a dollar bill, that there's more to him. Especially, I try to go through his young life, being his father dying at age 11 and having a rather domineering mother that kind of ran his life. He was fortunate to have an older brother from his father's first marriage who served as a father figure for him until he was 20 years old. So knowing that kind of thing, I think people can see that he's as human as anybody that comes to these functions. He's as human as you or I, and he has his foibles as well as his excellent character traits that were endued by his older brother and by his domineering mother also. But most of all, he saw himself as a gentleman, and during that time period there were certain virtues and characteristics that were expected of gentlemen. And he started out as a young man, he copied down 110 rules of civility. That was an original from monks during the Renaissance, had put together ideas, such important things as don't pick your teeth with your fork, or don't spit in the fire, things like that, but as well as how to deport yourself when you're with other people. So he was cultivating himself as a gentleman's gentleman throughout his life, and his biggest thing was control of himself, so that he would portray a gentleman. He did not want to, he had a temper, and he did not want that temper to come out, because when he did that, he would lose that civility that he wanted so much. And there are a few times that he let it go during battles several times. Thomas Jefferson witnessed one in a cabinet meeting that frightened him, to be blunt. But Washington was able to control that kind of thing. He appeared to be reticent, appeared to be almost shy, but he also was controlling himself to make sure that what he said was well thought out. He listened to people, and he did not make decisions until he had thought it completely through. So many people thought he was a little slow, but he was a thinker, and he did not do things rashly. So that's probably one of the biggest things that I try to portray, is that he is a man who learned, he thought, and was constantly making himself better. And that is something that is portrayed throughout his life. Up until the end of the French and Indian War, you can see that he's kind of a selfish young man. What's good for George Washington is good for the colony of Virginia. That changes as the Revolution comes, and it becomes what's good for America is good for George Washington. He turns it around, and that's something I like to convey.
That's very, very impressive. I've often told my students that without George Washington, we would not have won the Revolutionary War. Without George Washington, there would have been no successful constitutional convention. And without George Washington, we don't have a successful presidency. What made George Washington, number one, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen?
Well, I think you pointed it out. He, James Thomas Flexner, who wrote a biography of him, multi-volume biography, calls him the indispensable man. And time and again, he steps forward during the French and Indian War. He steps forward as a leader of his colonial forces. He learns politics. He learns all these things. Then when around his home, he demonstrates leadership again, changing things, trying different things. He's always trying to improve things. And then during the Revolutionary War, of course, despite the danger to himself, he leads the troops. He leads the troops. He is not just a commander who sits in a tent and directs soldiers like Horatio Gates has been accused of doing that. He is at the front, and he's actually under fire during the war. He leads. And one of the real things you pointed out is when the government starts, when our new government under the Constitution starts, he sets an example by being a forceful influence, but not a demagogue, not a loud, boisterous voice. Instead, he leads by example and shows what needs to be done and what doesn't need to be done. He gave up power. It wasn't power that he wanted. At the end of the Revolutionary War, he goes home. At the end, he says, I'm going home, and if you guys want to have an army or whatever, that's fine. Have a peacetime army, but I'm not going to be part of it. I'm going home. He loved Mount Vernon. He did not like being away. And then at the end of his first term as president, he wanted to go home again. He was worried that Mount Vernon would fall into disrepair and wanted to be home. But his friends, James Madison especially, convinced him that if the country will stay together if they have you to hold on to, was what he was told. So he did the second term. But then at the end of the second term, he was getting old. And he's 65 years old. He doesn't. His family is short-lived. All his uncles and brothers have died off, and he's the oldest male to live. And he wants to go home and finish his under his own vine and fig tree,
right,
as he said. And it's said, and it may be apocryphal, but that Benjamin West, the famous artist, was in England, and he was painting a portrait of George III. And when George III heard that Washington was voluntarily giving up the presidency, he said that if he does that, he'll be the greatest man in the world.
Yep.
And that's the kind of, he sets precedence by what he does.
Yes, King George III did say he would be the greatest man of his age. At two different points in time, stepping down from leading the Continental Army and stepping down from the great powers of the presidency.
Right.
I am struck by your outfit. A good reenactor has to have a proper uniform or a proper set of clothes. How much money have you got invested in the outfit you're wearing today? Where did you get it from? And what other George Washington outfits do you have?
Well, I'm not sure how much money I've invested in this. My wife raises her eyebrows every once in a while when I have to get a cravat or some small thing to add to the uniform. There are colonial outfits that are available through Townsend and Sons, or I'm trying to think of the others, but Sampson's. They are regular outfitters that can make such outfits for you. I have a civilian coat, a civilian outfit that I wear if I'm portraying President Washington. This uniform that I have on now is the uniform that he wore when he was called back to duty during the Quasi-War with France in 1798. He never actually wore general stars until that time. During the Revolutionary War, he was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He was not a lieutenant general, major general. He was the commander-in-chief. And so when he was brought back for the French War, which never took place, he was given the rank of lieutenant general with 3 stars. So that's how I portray it today.
Tell me about your latest book.
My latest book, well...
And hold it up for the audience to see.
Well, this is a book that actually I began many years ago when I visited Monmouth battlefield as part of a teacher training that I was going through. And I thought that the Battle of Monmouth has been deemed by our historians of today as a draw. The British were able to walk off the battlefield. The Americans held the battlefield. They kind of mutually left. My thesis for this book is that it was a victory for the American cause because the British were forced to retreat. Throughout the war, they had been trying to nail down the American army and fight them in a decisive battle. Well, the Americans were there. Here's your chance for a decisive battle. And instead, they march away. So the Americans saw that as a victory. And in addition to that, George Washington, for him, it was a personal victory. Because up until this time, his fortunes had been up and down. Our army was not the best army in the world. We're dealing with professional soldiers from Europe, and ours are militia. We had some veterans from the French and Indian War, but most of our men were young and or very old. We had 60-year-old enlistees, and so our army was not doing well. But after Monmouth, the British basically back off, and there are no major engagements with Washington's army, and Washington does not have any rivals anymore. Charles Lee, one of his biggest rivals, a former British general, seemed to be a capable officer. He did not do well at the Battle of Monmouth, and he fades into obscurity. And
in fact, wasn't that one of the great exhibitions of Washington's anger was during the Battle of Monmouth, where he lost control?
Yes, he lost control. Charles Lee took offense at that. Most of the people that were there do not agree on what happened. He probably called him a poltroon, and which, of course, is the old thing that you would say about somebody that was not performing well.
I remember reading one of the foot soldiers said, "Oh, if the leaves could have fallen off the tree while Washington redressed Lee, it was marvelous."
Well, and there are accounts that by people that weren't near him. Charles Scott said he swore like an angel in heaven, which I often wondered, how did you get an angel in heaven swearing? But that kind of thing, that he wasn't actually there, but that some of the accounts are people who secondhand heard it. But he did lose his temper, and Charles Lee did not take well to it and tried to politically maneuver this into an advantage, which there was no advantage available. And so he lost out, and Horatio Gates was dealt with again. All Washington needed was a victory to show that he was capable of victories. And there was no doubt then, and the others then fade away after Monmouth.
What a marvelous story. So, Jeff, It's a pleasure to talk to you. Continue your good work, God's work, and we'll see you later.
Thank you very much.